This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 203 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. And today's topic is all about taking student exchange trips. So for some of us, if we can reach back in time to our teenage selves, we might have been very fortunate and privileged enough to be able to study abroad, go on some kind of student exchange or some kind of school trip. And without fail, I think these things are pretty life-changing. And interestingly, I think they're beneficial not just for the student who does the exchange, but for lots of the people around them as well. So my own experience is definitely that it was, really an important part of my growing up, I suppose. When I was 14, as you've probably heard me mention many times, I must admit, on the podcast, I was lucky enough to spend a month in Germany. So I was part of a group of students, I think probably 20 of us, who travelled to 3 different parts of Germany over a period of 4 weeks, and we got to stay with 3 different host families each. So we were on our own with our host families, but then we would meet up during the day, perhaps with our host siblings or with just our group, and do various excursions, sometimes go to school and so on. So it was quite a varied trip, but it was 1990. There was no internet or anything. We didn't have any contact with our parents for the whole week. I sent my mum and dad a postcard from the first place we stayed. I think the postcard beat me home, but it wouldn't have been by much. And I do think now of imagining my son in only like 3.5 years or so he'll be 14. Imagine him going away from me for a month like that. It's terrifying. But fortunately we have the internet, so it would be different. But nonetheless, that month away was completely life-changing for me, made me feel so much more independent and completely opened my eyes up to the rest of the world yet again. I'd been to Europe once as a 9-year-old, but to see it as a 14-year-old, and we were there during the reunification of East and West Germany, which was also completely mind-blowing and really bizarre. So all of these things happened, and I think that really changed a lot for us. So that's my experience, but I've got a few more people to talk about various aspects of student exchange trips today. And the first one is Abby Lewtas, who had a somewhat similar experience to me, in fact.
The first time that I travelled away from my parents, I was 14, and we were just sort of briefly talking about this before, because now I'm sort of allowing this opportunity for other young people. I take teenagers away normally on their first overseas trip without their parents. And yeah, I think I remember going on mine. I went on I guess it was an exchange. It was about 2 to 3 weeks over to the United States, and we did some touristy things and got to stay with a host family, and it was just this whole new world for me. Like, all when you're 14 is your home and the 4 walls. And even back then, like, we didn't have social media, so you really just know your immediate surrounds and your friends and family. So, going out to places that you just would never have seen before, and especially going to the States, which seemed like such a place where things were so advanced, and, just even having like cinnamon candy and these types of things. This is like something that you'd never have in Australia. It was just mind-blowing. And so, I think that was really a life-changing moment for me, because it really showed me that I could go out and be in a different country and experience the world.
I love Abby mentioning that even cinnamon candy seemed so advanced. I do remember so many things in Germany seeming very advanced. One that stuck in my mind for years was that back then, 1990, they were already you already had to pay if you wanted to use a plastic bag at the supermarket. Otherwise, you would bring your own. And it is really like, literally, was it just last year, I think, here in Australia that we caught up with that, like nearly 30 years later. That's always astounded me. So it's very much eye-opening to spend significant time as a teenager in another country. Now, my next guest is Patti Buff, and we actually met through Twitter when we were talking about writers' retreats. But by sheer coincidence, it turned out that she had some years ago spent a year here from America here in Perth as a Rotary exchange student for a year. So it was really fascinating to talk to her. We chatted for a long time about this, but this is an extract from that conversation.
Well, I was lucky enough to be chosen to be a Rotary exchange student. So in the year of 1988 to 1989, which was my senior year of high school.
So how old were you?
So
sorry to ask about age, but
yes. 17 going on 18.
Right. Okay.
And so when I left. Yeah. And so I went, flew all the way over to Australia. That was a very long flight. And it was even longer because as a group, we had to fly. So I flew out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, then flew to San Francisco. And in San Francisco, we had picked up a whole bunch of more exchange students, Rotary exchange students. And so we were like a group of, I think, about 20 Americans on this flight from San Francisco. First, we flew to Auckland, New Zealand, dropped people off in Auckland. And then we flew to Sydney. And then from Sydney to Melbourne.
Oh, gosh.
Where I got to fly over
the long way around.
It was a very long way around. And I remember because for me, of course, it was August. And I looked out of my window over the Blue Mountains and I was like, what is that white stuff? And the Australian chap who was sitting next to me, he looked out, he's like, that's snow. Haven't you ever seen snow before? And I'm like,
yes, but not in August.
Southern Hemisphere. I am no longer in the summer season. I am coming in the middle of winter.
Oh, no.
So that was a big kind of shock to my brain right then and there. And so then from Melbourne, then we flew straight to Perth.
Right.
And then from Perth, I was picked up by my kind of the person who was in charge of me, Peter White. He was my counselor the entire time, and he drove me down to Rockingham, which is where I lived. But I actually went to Safety Bay High School.
Right. Yep.
And so,
cool.
Yeah, it was, lots of changes all at once. Going from, being completely, jet lagged.
Yes.
To walking and trying to get into the driver's seat of the car.
Oh,
because
yes.
it was on the opposite side.
Oh, I've done that too, yes.
And trying not to freak out as we're driving on the wrong side of the road. Or to me, the wrong side. Sorry. But, we're driving on the opposite side of the road. And just kind of trying to figure out how that all works, because it was a clutch and I always grew up driving a clutch. And I was like, do you have to use the different feet? Are the pedals the wrong way too? And so I was very, very curious. And then the Australian accent, of course, took some getting used to.
Yes, I understand.
And it was, I think I had like one day off and then I was sent straight to school. So I had a day to recover and then I started school because it was the middle of the term. It was the end of August. So started school, didn't know a soul. But it was fine. I mean, I'm an adventurous person. But the worst thing is I had a really hard time understanding everybody.
Right.
And so I wasn't able to keep up. And so for the first week, maybe 2 weeks, I was quite quiet. And until I was able to really get a hold of the accent and I was able to understand what everything meant. Once I got over that language hurdle, it wasn't a barrier, but it was a hurdle. I started talking and I never shut up. And they were like, we thought you were really shy. I'm like, no.
No, you guys were just speaking a foreign language to me.
Exactly. And so it was pretty funny. And
amazing.
yeah. So once I was able to understand what people were talking about and able to contribute, my social life, went up heaps and bounds and, made some really good friends. And then I did, a lot of traveling within Western Australia, which was fantastic. Three of the families, I ended up staying with 6 families in my 12 months there, which was pretty extreme.
Yeah, that's a lot, I think, for usual.
Yeah. But it was good. It was, I enjoyed it and got to, about half of them were, I'll call them native Australians. So they were born and raised in Australia. And the other half were British who had resettled then. And so that was a nice mixture of things. And the Australians loved to camp. Yeah. And they all had these campers. And so they would take me out on the weekends and we'd go camping. And it was so much fun being in Australia and just, camping in the outback, seeing the nature. Whenever the school did a field trip, so there was one day we went on that they had planned a field trip to, I think it was a water reservoir. And so they're like, hey, Patti, come along. You haven't been to this part yet, have you? And I'm like, nope, nice. Haven't. Would love to. So They just took me along with them. And just had a picnic, and it's just a really green area, and just really beautiful. Yep.
Oh, that's amazing. I mean, 17, 18, that's a really impressionable time to be, and to be away from your family and away from your country for that long. It's pretty full on. Yeah. I mean, how did you cope well? Did it change you?
I did. I mean, of course I got homesick, and this was, pre-internet, pre-computers, email, anything like that. And so, I bought a stack of 100 of those single page aerograms.
Yeah.
And I wrote at least one a week to my family. Mm-hmm. And I filled that thing on both sides, and just explaining all of my adventures. And that was really kind of my diary. And my mom kept them all for me.
Perfect.
And so I still have them. And then I used the others, to send, letters to my friends. And they were all really mad at me that I was leaving my senior year of high school.
Right.
Because this was our last year together.
Yeah.
But I had 2 older sisters who had also been Rotary Exchange students their senior years. Right. My sister Bridget went to the Philippines, and my sister Martha went to South Africa.
Wow.
Listening to their experiences, I was just like, this is what I'm going to do. This is
worth it. This is worth missing senior year at home for. Yeah.
It was fate. It was just this was what I was meant to do. I was meant to do an exchange program my senior year of high school. Yeah. And I never regretted it. I mean, yes, I, lost out on quite a few things. Wasn't there for the prom, wasn't there for the homecoming court, didn't do graduation. But it was worth it. It was
what you gained was worth it. Yeah. Yeah.
Completely. Yeah. And I became so self-assured and self-reliant. And I knew that I could pick myself up and go anywhere in the world, which is what happened. Years later is exactly what happened. Yeah. And I didn't realize that I would be living in Europe with my husband and family, but that's what happened. And so I've been here in Germany now for 19 years. Yeah. And I don't regret that either. So
no, and I wonder if you could have, a sliding doors moment if you hadn't spent that year abroad. Maybe you wouldn't have felt the confidence to kind of, get into a relationship with someone from elsewhere or move to another continent, I think those kind of moments or especially those really deep experiences can be really life-changing. So Definitely.
Yeah. And so it was, it formed me as a person. It really did.
Such an amazing experience to be doing that as a 17, 18-year-old, I think, to be on the very other side of the world, like quite literally, and to have all those different experiences. Now, one thing struck me in that conversation that I thought I might explain for our younger listeners, because Patti and I were enthusing about aerograms, and I'm pretty sure my son would have not a clue what an aerogram is, and probably people also, a decade or two older than him as well. So aerograms were this thing that we used a lot when in my childhood to write to people overseas. And I sound so old explaining this, but anyway, they were a very thin piece of paper that you would folded three ways into kind of an envelope shape, but you could unfold it and write all over it basically. And because it was so thin and therefore light, then it was like the cheapest way to mail a letter. So it was kind of, so a thin folded piece of paper. I still have many that my friends sent to me and vice versa from when I was abroad when I was younger too. So I can just imagine Patti with her pile of aerograms. So there you go. Now, my final guest today is actually I didn't plan to interview her about this topic, but we just got chatting about it. And it's one of my listeners from episode 200 and 201, Jane Wood. And we happened to get onto this topic, and she had a really interesting perspective about student exchange trips, and kind of from the reverse angle, the host angle. And so we chatted about what it was like for her and her family to host exchange students.
I mean, when my kids were growing up, we had exchange students from Europe stay with us all the time. So
cool.
For 4 to 6 months at a time. So my kids were very... I couldn't afford to, travel with my kids. My husband lived in England, so he went over there and travelled over there. But I thought, how do we do this? How do we do that? And we did it by bringing kids over here that lived with my kids and taught them French and German and, And then when my kids graduated from high school, they both went to Europe for 3 months and were looked after by their... yeah.
That's so cool.
And now they've both got the bug. So
I was going to say, because it's not even the going places that gives them the bug. It's the teaching them the curiosity, I think, and by having people from different cultures living with you like that. I mean, 100%. That's going to make it that way.
Best thing we ever did.
Great idea. Yeah,
and it made us travel around WA as well.
Yes, because you got to show them everything.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah.
So I mean, every weekend we were out doing things. It changed the whole dynamics of our family and opened my kids' world, made them quite worldly. So which is great. And the ripple effect, though, because my exchange students then made friends with other kids here that then travelled to France or to Germany to meet them, and so it just the ripple effect of that has just been amazing, and now the parents and us keep in contact, and it's just wonderful. I just think it's
that gives me chills. It's so cool.
I know. And we would sit over dinner. We would sit down at dinner especially with my first French girl, who came back 3 times after that.
Wow.
I know, amazing. But we would sit down at dinner and we would go through our entire dinner in French and try and learn what we had for dinner.
Awesome.
So and then every time we did anything like that, we'd sit there and like, okay, let's have our French lesson today.
That's so lovely.
My son was only 12, but he still remembers it all. He's now 23, so he still remembers it all.
That's awesome. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I remember when I was a teenager, we had a couple of German students come and stay with us because I was studying German, and I'd been to Germany on like a school trip, and so that was and we had a couple of them, and by chance we ended up, or by bad planning really, we ended up having 2 at the same time, kind of accidentally. So it was kind of crowded at home, but it was just wonderful because they could also, speak to each other a little bit in German and translate things and back and forth. And we took them all over the state, and it was just, lovely fun.
It's amazing. So. I used to sit on the step. We've got our bedrooms are sort of a couple of steps lower down. I used to sit on the step when our French girl Juliette came over for the 3rd time. She had a boyfriend, and she used to Skype her boyfriend in the evenings. And her door was shut, but I'd just sit there and I had no idea what she was saying. And I wasn't eavesdropping, but I was just listening to her French because she was from south of France. It's such a beautiful accent. And I'll just sit there and listen to her.
Like music.
Yeah.
Oh, that's lovely.
Yeah,
oh,
I met a German girl from Hamburg as well. She was amazing.
Cool.
Yeah,
awesome.
So my kids have both been to Hamburg and to
Hamburg's an awesome city.
Amazing times. Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool. What a great way to as an alternative to travel is to kind of bring the world to you. I'd never thought about it from this perspective, but it makes absolute sense. I know when we had our German exchange student stay with us, it was nearly as good as being able to go to Germany as well. It was such an eye-opening experience as well. So that was, really interesting to chat to Jane about that. And I hope that one day my son might consider going on some kind of exchange trip as well. I think there's so many options these days, and there's also, for example, if for university students, there's so many more study abroad programs. Obviously not right now in COVID times, but in the future. I know I tutor at one of the universities here in Perth sometimes, and in the student services area, there's this enormous rack of brochures with featuring all of the universities where students from that university can go on a study abroad program. And I longingly gaze over them and wonder where I might have gone if I'd had those chances back then. And I confess that I sometimes bring brochures home for my son to look at to give him some ideas as well. So you never know what will happen down the road. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this episode about student exchange trips. And I bet there are heaps of listeners out there who also took part in these kind of student trips. So I would love to hear about them. Hop over to our Facebook group. It's called Thoughtful Travellers, and have a chat with us there. Tell me what your experience was like. I would love to know more. And if you aren't a member of Thoughtful Travellers, just come along, search for Thoughtful Travellers in Facebook and you should find us. If not, there's a link in the show notes as well. Thank you very much to my fabulous guests, as always. So today we chatted with Abby Lewtas. Abby has actually been a guest on the podcast in the early days, but we chatted a little bit more recently, and she is these days running the Wanderluster's Mind podcast. So look that up. It's a good one. And you can find all of her info at abbylewtas.com. And a big thank you also to Patti Buff. Patti is a writer based in Germany, and you can find out more about her writing at pattibuff.wordpress.com. And a very big shout out and thank you to Jane, our fabulous listener, who has had something, very useful to say on this topic as well. All of these links and everything else will be in the show notes. And for this episode, they're at notaballerina.com/203. As always, thank you so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.